Today I have Craig Carter, who's a professor at Arizona State University and editor emeritus of Journal Supply Chain Management, and we're going to be having one of our replication conversations. So Craig, the first question I asked you was, what paper would you like to see replicated? And obviously you're raring to go, so have at it.
Outstanding. Thank you, Mark. So the paper that I chose was Carter and Jennings. This was a paper that was published in the Journal of Business Logistics in 2004. And it was motivated by my desire to bring together what I saw at the time as almost jigsaw puzzle pieces of different dimensions of what we were calling really as a discipline social responsibility at the time. I think we could also frame this as sustainability, but that's another conversation. And when I mentioned jigsaw puzzle pieces, this was both academically and in practice. So managers, companies were often managing these various sets of activities in a very silo-like fashion without a lot of conversations between different parts of their businesses. And that was true in academia as well. We were seeing papers that were cited and they were very narrowly focused without recognizing that there could be potential overlap with other dimensions of social responsibility. So this paper was really two parts. It was one set of data, but there were two parts to the paper in the sense that one, we wanted to understand if this was a second order construct, a higher level conceptualization of these various first order constructs. And that's what you see on the screen that's shown. And the answer in short was yes, without getting into a lot of details. And then two, we wanted to look at the drivers, the antecedents of purchasing social responsibility. And that's the second slide that I'm showing you, where we looked at various largely within firm organizational level antecedents, although there were some from outside of the firm as well, government regulation and customer pressures, so external stakeholder pressures. That's the paper that I chose. And I chose it in part, Mark, because I did partially replicate this paper. Due to the vagaries of the review process, replication came out in the same year. That's another story. But in any case, with the first paper, what I showed you initially, Carter and Jennings 2004, this was based on a sample of approximately 200 consumer products firms, so firms in the consumer products industry. And there was an opportunity to replicate just that first part of the paper with a much larger sample through a project with the Institute for Supply Management. So with the second paper, which is a partial replication, and it's a replication just of the second order CFA, we were able to survey approximately 1,100 firms in both manufacturing and a broad base of manufacturing and service, and a broad base of service industries. And we found that the factor structure largely held. I think there was one scale item that didn't hold in the service industry, one set of service industries, but it largely held. So that was a long answer to your question, but the short answer was Carter and Jennings 2004.
Excellent. So you've already replicated it once. Why would you like to see it replicated again now?
Right, very, very fair question. The reason why is that a lot of time has passed. These data were collected in 1999, if my memory serves, for Carter and Jennings 2004, and in 2003, I think early 2003, for the slide that you see here, the Carter 2000 paper that was published in the Journal of Supply Chain Management, which was really more of a note. So during that intervening time period, over 15 years, or over 20 years, a lot has changed, right, in terms of what we think about social responsibility, how that's shifted more towards sustainability. Your work with Shevchenko in JSCM, your 2014 paper, that really talks about the idea of, well, in part, maybe sustainability is really being less unsustainable, as well as perhaps a ranking, a hierarchy of different parts of sustainability, all of which intrigue me, all of which I think I agree with. But in any case, times have changed. So I'd like to understand whether this structure still holds, and you'll notice that ethics is in there. It didn't load on this factor, but conceptually, the reason why we think it didn't is that it's at a much more foundational level. If you look at Carroll's hierarchy, for example, So there are a number of reasons, largely time-based reasons, why I would like to replicate what you see here on the screen, the second order factor structure. I'd like to add more scale items. I'd like to see if things have changed, but also methodologically, we used a single informant. These were different times, and for a number of reasons, that's why we chose that methodology. But well, I'd like to get into that actually, if I could. Okay, going back to the Carter 2004 partial replication, this was really a substantive domain replication in the sense that conceptually, methodologically, everything remained the same with Carter and Jennings. So why further replication? That's your question. Well, I'd like to do a strict replication first, because that would sort of be the constant that would help us to understand whether time might be a factor. It's not a guarantee, but if we could hold everything else equal, then we'd have some sense about whether things may have changed. But I would like to also add additional scale items. Certainly the environmental construct, that was one construct to represent all of the when we think about the 3PL, it represented all of the environmental dimension of sustainability. And obviously we'd want to flesh that out much further. So that would be one reason to do that. I can think of other constructs where we may want to add items. If you think about diversity, diversity was viewed very differently 20 years ago, I would argue, than it is today. We think about diversity more broadly. We think about the barriers to diversity. Anyways, there are some scale items where I would probably add, some scales where I'd probably add items. And then methodologically, I would use multiple informants, in part to measure something like organizational culture. I'd probably use multiple informants within supply management. That's something I haven't thought about as much, but when we think about sort of thought worlds of different functional areas, that's the one that I'm most interested in. But maybe others as well, maybe informants from outside of supply management. I would certainly use a different informant to measure the PSR second order construct and the first order constructs than I would for some of the antecedent constructs. So that would be another change that I'd make. And I also thought about top management leadership and wondered, well, is there a secondary data source that we might be able to use in terms of annual reports? I don't know. These are, these are just thoughts that I'm putting out there as I brainstormed based on your set of questions.
Cool. Building on that, one of the things I was thinking of when you were talking about the time that had passed is that it seems like, we often talk about academia being behind practice, but I think when it comes to sustainability, we could argue that we've been ahead of practice, certainly for the last 20 years. So I wonder if part of the reason certain things didn't work in 2004 was just that we were thinking about it, but managers were not. And I wonder if the same thing would happen now. So, if you look at what leading companies are doing with sustainability or governance, things like, talking about what would be called tax planning by some companies and tax evasion by other people, things like that probably aren't on the radar of the typical organization yet, but I'm guessing would be sort of bundled into this in a decade. Is a survey going to capture that, or would you end up once more reflecting the past as opposed to the future? In other words, would there be is there a way to get to where companies are moving to?
That's a good point. And I think that there's maybe a different set of objectives. If we think about the model that I showed you, it's asking what are the antecedents to what you're currently doing?
Okay.
Rather than what might you be doing in the future. Although what you raise is certainly an interesting opportunity for another study. I also think that that's an interesting and astute point that you make regarding which was leading which. And I think that is true. I think we were leading practice. I remember someone saying around 2000, well, it was about research that he saw in 2000. And then it's probably about 12 years later, he said, I remember seeing that presentation. I thought it's interesting, but it's a bunch of fluff. And now I realize, oh, this is something we have to be doing. This is real. And you were just kind of ahead, and others who were doing research in this area were just kind of ahead of what we were thinking about at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry for the curveball question, but
That's okay.
it is kind of, interesting to think about, would there be sources of secondary data or something like that that might be a form of extension where you could look at the same types of things, but try and get to where companies were going, or maybe it's more a function of the sampling rather than a generic sample, have a subsample of organizations who are viewed as ahead of the curve, if you will, or something like that, and see if there's some differences there. I mean, obviously, the purpose of these videos is to get people thinking.
Absolutely.
Luckily, neither you nor I need answers at this point. So I really appreciate that you took the time to think about this and took the time to talk to us about this. And I wish you a great day.
Mark, thanks so much. Always a pleasure chatting with you.